Morning, we continue the story of Joshua. Now, if you don't know Joshua, we actually get introduced to Joshua earlier in Exodus, and then he shows up a couple of times in the other books between Exodus and his book in Joshua. And he does a couple of things in the book of Exodus with Moses that sort of establishes him as first Moses' assistant, but then sort of the obvious choice for the person who will follow after Moses. Certainly when God said, all right, Moses, after Moses dies, that Joshua is going to be the one in the charge, nobody who had been paying attention would be surprised by this. And actually we delve into that pretty good on Thursday in our Bible study. We talked about a lot about what Joshua did. One of the things that Joshua did earlier, when he was still just the assistant to Moses, was Joshua was actually part of the first group of spies that were sent into the land. So God's people have been camped on the wrong side of the Jordan, like we talked about last week, and they had on a couple of occasions now sent people in to go see what it is and what was going on in this place where they understood God telling them to go. Basically trying to figure out how much resistance do they think they're going to meet, what's going on there. Is this really good land? There's a little bit of testing happening here. We're like, where we are doesn't look so bad. Is that really any better? So Moses decides to send some people in to check the place out. And Joshua is one of the ones who gets sent in. And they come back initially with a pretty good report that the land is fertile and it flows with milk and honey is what they say, and it really is a good place, but the people there are very, very strong. This is not going to be easy. And actually that whole group of spies comes back the first time and says, we're not sure we can do this, including Joshua. Now, one of them, Caleb, will say, no, maybe, if God's on our side, we probably can. And then Joshua would be the next one to kind of come around and say, oh, well, yes, probably we could, if God really wants us to do this, even though it's going to be hard. So flash forward in time to the point we are now. Joshua is the one now in charge. Moses is gone, and he needs to basically lead the people to the other side of the river, and he elects to do what Moses had done before him, which is to send some spies to double-check things. And specifically sends them to Jericho, which they probably didn't get to before, but know enough to know that is an important city and a strong city. So they're like, go to Jericho and check that place out. So that's why we have this story, and that's why these people are sent to do this. Now, of course, what's interesting, and it's always been interesting to me, when you encounter the stories, is like, okay, you three, guys, all go across the river and go into the promised land that we're offered and check out Jericho. And of course, what is the first thing they do? They go to the prostitute's house, right? I mean, he literally says, go to Jericho, and it's the first stop that they make. And now, you can read into this if you want to, I suppose. And people have over the years tried to figure out, why is it that this is the first place that they go? Is this just, frankly, guys being guys? Like, what's going on here? And if we take a step back, it actually makes a little bit more sense than maybe we would initially think. And maybe there's a little more going on here than just a group of guys taking advantage of a weekend away. That was supposed to be a joke, but fine. Y'all gonna have to work with me here. There aren't very many of you today. All right. So obviously we have these people, right? We have these Israelites. They are coming on the wrong side of the Jordan. They have been wandering in the desert for 40 years at this point. Originally, we know where they came from, right? So these are freed. These are slaves that have left Egypt, who have then been wandering a nomadic life for 40 years. These are not the most important people in the world right now as far as everyone else is concerned. These are not people of great wealth. They are not people of great prosperity, as they have been wandering in the wilderness, relying on things like bread from heaven in order to survive. So it actually makes some sense
that when they were to enter the city, the first place that they weren't going to go was to the king, and they weren't going to go to the important people. What is this band of basically refugees going to do but to seek out the others who are like them? Now, there's been an attempt over the years to sort of clean up Rahab's reputation a little bit and talk about her more as like an innkeeper, or something along those regards. Unfortunately, both the Hebrew behind it and the context and everything else that happens don't let us do that. The truth is, Rahab was herself someone on the margins of her own community. She existed in this world. We will eventually, if you keep reading the story, we'll read about her parents. We'll read about the fact that she has a family. But for some reason, and we're not told why, but for some reason, the responsibility to care for the family and care for the home and to keep the home going has fallen not on her parents or her father, but has fallen for some reason on Rahab. And Rahab, as a single woman, at a time when single women weren't really all that well thought of, is basically forced into a situation where she has to do what she has to do in order for her and her family to survive. So think about it in those contexts. It actually makes a lot of sense, why these former slave refugees from somewhere else would seek out another group, or at least another person, where a group of people who were living on the margins would then seek out somebody else who's living on the margins of their own community. So it actually makes sense that this is the place that they would go, because it's probably the place where they most fit in, and it is the place where they will find people who are in as desperate a situation as the Israelites are. We must remember it's too easy in our minds because, frankly, when we think about this time, we think about the life of Moses and everything else that goes on, most of us have Charlton Heston in our brain, right? Unfortunately, it wasn't really like that. The Israelites are in a very, very desperate situation and have been for a while and need to get to a place where they can put down some roots and start growing some food and start rebuilding up their community, which has been taken apart for years. In many ways, the Methodist movement, of which that I am, and I hope most of us are proud to be a part, has a similar background. We've talked about John Wesley a lot because I love me some John Wesley. And the truth was that John Wesley and the early Methodist was a movement of people who didn't fit in, right? It was a movement of people who could never describe themselves as normal, in much the worst way that I would ever hesitate to describe us in such a way. Right? It was the people that the people in the good church and the proper church had all left behind. And really what started the Methodist movement in the first part was John Wesley going around and saying, but what about all of them? And so early on, the Methodist movement actually wasn't very well thought of, and it certainly wasn't very well thought of in England. And in John Wesley's time, because the camera hadn't been invented yet, and because pictures really weren't a thing yet, things like illustrations were really important. And what we kind of live on today in the form of like political cartoons, were even more so and even more dramatic and even more in-depth in John Wesley's time because they didn't have pictures. And so in order for things like newspapers and pamphlets and brochures to be something other than just all words, there were many people who were empowered whose livelihood was to basically draw like caricatures of things. And one of those early artists turned his attention to a lot of things, but one of the things he turned himself attention to was early Methodists. And this was one of the things that appeared in that. The title of this one, next one please. The title of, maybe? Okay, it's coming. The title of this one is Credulity, Superstition, and Fanaticism. And so I know it's a little hard to make out there, but what you have is what we have there is a picture of kind of a standard church of the time with the three-story high pulpit. I've always wanted one. I saw when we were there once, and I'm like, man, I want to climb up there in that three-story. There is literally like pulpits where you're standing up like almost like eye level with the balcony and like looking down on the crowds. And I'm like, oh, that looks like a good place to preach from. Anywho, so they had these three-story kind of pulpits at the time, and like the lay leader would be like the person reading the scripture would be down there and the pastor would be up here. And there's this great depiction of Methodists doing that. And instead of everybody looking like stately and proper in the way that you're expected to look at a church in the 1700s, they are just having a wild good time. There are like people like laying down on the ground, slain in the spirit. There are just like all kinds of crazy stuff happening. Because one of the things that was leveled as a charge against Methodists at the time was this idea of fanaticism, which is this idea of basically you all are having too good a time at church. No laughing. I would have got myself in trouble. A lot. And part of the reason why people took shots at them, and part of the reason why this artist in particular took shots at them, is this artist, really his work was circulated really amongst kind of the proper people of the time. And one of the things that he liked to depict was, how untamed and how poor and how vulgar people were. And unfortunately, the early Methodist movement was really a movement of people who were working class. It was movements of orphans and widows. It was movements really of the poor and people who had kind of been left behind in a way that we don't really understand today because they lived in a world with zero safety nets. And because that was the Methodist movement in the beginning, people took shots at them. And so this artist in particular, he actually did a couple other ones that I found really interesting that I just want to show you. One of them is called Gin Lane. That's this one coming up. So again, I know it's kind of hard to see, but Gin Lane, there was a big problem at the time, which, before gin was kind of the street drug of the day. And so he had two pictures that he painted or drew. One was Gin Lane, and this, if you can kind of see, there's like people just kind of laying all over the place, and they're emaciated, and terrible things are happening, and it's bad people doing bad things, and look how awful these people are, and they need to make better life choices, and blah, blah, blah. And then he compares it to this next picture, which is called Beer Street, which is apparently where all the respectable people are. So if you want to be a respectable person, you want to hang out on Beer Street. If you want to be disrespectful, you hang out in Gin Lane. Because apparently, Water Avenue wasn't a thing, right? That apparently was just unheard of. So Methodism kind of has this in our roots. We kind of have this in our DNA. We kind of know who Rahab is, and we kind of know what she is. And so it's interesting that we find not only in our own roots as a movement, as a denomination, the same thing that God's people find in their own history before they've even taken on the land, that the first ally that they find, the first helper that they find, the first person that actually takes interest in what they're doing and is willing to aid them in the work that God is about, is someone that the rest of her community had dismissed. Methodists started by gathering those who the rest of the community had dismissed. Now, this was how we began, but it wasn't always how we were. So I want to share two quick stories about two quick pastors because I'm allowed to make fun of other pastors. We're allowed to make fun of our own. That's the way things work. All right, so first is probably a guy you've never heard of called Reverend Paul Smith. Here he is. So Reverend Paul Smith was a pastor of Central United Methodist Church, which at the time in 1917, so put your head 100 years in the past, at the time in 1917 was a Methodist church in the Tenderloin district of San Francisco. Which had been a pretty reputable district basically before the earthquake, but then after the earthquake, so we're like 10 years after the earthquake that pretty much leveled the whole city. So 10 years after the earthquake that leveled the whole city, that area of San Francisco took on, shall we say, a different flavor. And it was a place that sprung up with a lot of bars and a lot of things like that, and also sprung up with a bunch of brothels. And so our good Reverend Smith here took it upon himself to really lead the crusade against all of these folks around him, especially the brothel and the brothel owners were kind of the main site of his work. And there's this great quote from the time. It says, newspapers at the time quoted saying that Smith's fiery sermons condemning the world's oldest profession did more to spark the flames of curiosity in his men of his congregation than the tenderloin prostitutes could do on their own. Apparently, he got a little too into describing what was going on. I will avoid that mistake. And what was going on, and unfortunately, I guess Perry made people a little more curious than he should have made them. But he did. He kind of led this crusade against it, and he really condemned what he saw as something really vile happening around him, to the point that eventually Miss M.R. Gamble, who was a well-named brothel owner in the area, came and asked for a meeting with him to talk about what was going on and what he was actually after, and help him hopefully understand a little bit more what life was like for them. So they arranged the meeting, and she came with 300 of her colleagues, shall we say, to meet with him. There's actually a picture of it here. This is apparently how prostitutes 100 years ago dress. Like, okay. But they gathered with him, and they started to talk about, and one of the things that they wanted him help him understand was most of the women were there didn't actually want to be there. That actually most of the women who he was condemning were actually widows, people who had lost their husbands in the earthquake or in other things. Most of them who had children to care for and really had no other means to care for them, or at least they felt they had no other means to care for them than what they were doing. And so they said, if you want to end this, if you want to change this, that's fine, but we need something else to do. And oh, by the way, is the problem really us, or is the problem the men that are coming to us? Or is it maybe both? Because you seem to be talking a lot about us and not a lot about our customers. And in the exchange, I'd like to say, oh, that Smith got the point and he really helped lead some reforms that helped give these women another alternative to what they were doing and all that kind of stuff. No, he didn't do that. Instead, he continued his crusade and had some laws and ordinance passed that basically shut down everything. Many of the women who were there, situations even got worse. And almost as a direct effect of this work, a group of people organized and led the very successful movement to pass prohibition 15 years later. The idea being, obviously, well, maybe if we take their alcohol away, similar to the guy before in Wesley's time. Now, there's an alternative to this that we will also find in Methodist history. And the alternative is a guy named William Booth, who some of you may have heard of. William Booth was a pastor in the Methodist Reformed Church in England, which was kind of a brief break-off church that eventually integrated back into the main Methodist Church. But for a time, he was a pastor in that church, in the Methodist Church of England. And the thing that got him in trouble, and eventually to leave that ministry as a pastor, is the same thing that got John Wesley in trouble, which is he started to take an interest in the people around him that he was not seeing in his church. He started to take an interest in the people around him who were living on the margins of society. He took an interest in those who were being dismissed by everybody else. And so he decided to not be a local church pastor anymore and began the East London Christian Mission in 1865. And later on, he's quoted as saying of his work bringing people into the faith, he says, thieves, prostitutes, gamblers, and drunkards were among the first converts to Christianity, and soon those converts were also preaching and singing in the streets as a living testament to the power of God. Because this was a movement of those sorts of folks, he also realized that if he was going to help people no longer be thieves and drunkards and prostitutes, he needed to find a way to help them find a better way to live. So the mission that he started began to offer services to people, and what we would eventually kind of know this day, what we would call today like rehab. They didn't really call it that back then, but they started out those kind of services, work services, job training, all those sorts of things that we know are effective in helping getting people out of poverty. He started to offer those services through the church at a time when the church was not doing those things. And later on, as they were describing the work of their church, they were working with a guy who was writing a pamphlet about what they were doing and the movement that they'd begun. The guy who came and he was reading, Mr. Booth was reading the work that he had come. And one of the lines in the book, one of the lines in it was a quote from Mr. Booth, who said, "We are a volunteer army." To which his son replied, "I am not a volunteer, I'm a regular." So they coursed out the word volunteer and added the word salvation. William Booth is the founder of the Salvation Army. For those of you who are keeping score, the Salvation Army and Goodwill Industries were born out of the Methodist movement, because that's what we care about. Rahab, on the surface, was an unlikely ally, and maybe not, as we might think, the most helpful person to go to. It turns out, because the lives of the spies were saved, and they could go back and report the things they needed to report, she was exactly the right person. And if you keep reading chapter 2, which I commend to you to do, open up Joshua chapter 2, it's not very long, keep reading, and you will read that Rahab not only helps redeem and helps save and the lives of the spies that were sent, Rahab also notices something in them, in their mission and what they are doing. Rahab actually becomes one of the first people in Jericho, one of the first people on that side of the Jordan River to understand what God was doing and become part of God's work. Because Rahab noticed and understood that these spies, these refugees from somewhere else, these people literally with nothing, had something that she herself wanted to have. And of course, that something was hope. The people had hope, even though the odds were going to be against them, that God was going to do something in their midst and lead them to someplace better. Rahab wanted to go someplace better. Wesley wanted to bring the people of his time, who had been dismissed, to someplace better. Smith didn't quite get it. Booth did. As followers of Christ, we are offered one thing in abundance. And the thing we are offered in abundance is the hope that comes from a living God who's interested in us and cares about us as much as he cares about those refugees sitting on the wrong side of the Jordan River. We are offered the same thing they are offered, and the same thing that Rahab is offered. That even when things get hard, and we're kind of going through a hard moment right now. We're kind of going through a hard moment right now that I had hoped we had left behind in 2020 or 2021. We have hope, and we have the same hope now we had then. That God's love and grace will get us through it. That he will help us do things we didn't know we could do. He will continue to grace us and bless us and keep us in the same way that God has always graced and blessed and kept his people. That is the hope we have. That is the hope that the spies had. That's the hope that Joshua has. That is the hope that Rahab learned about and got so excited about. She said, "I'm in." Let us all remember who we are and whose we are, and let us all remind ourselves that we are invited to be into. Amen.